Well, welcome to unit number 5, where we'll be talking about the philosophy of Aristotle. This unit is divided into 2 parts and 2 videos and 2 sets of PowerPoint slides. We're starting off with Plato's Metaphysics. But as we're getting ready to start, I'd invite you to download the worksheet for Aristotle, the class worksheet, which is attached to the D2L section for Aristotle. This is the same sort of worksheet you had for Plato, a case where you can fill in blanks and follow along and get the core issues that you need together. So let's pause for a moment and have you download that worksheet, and we'll be ready to pick up the course from this point on. Alright, we're back together again now. You have your worksheet, and we're ready to make our way through the issues concerning Aristotle's metaphysics. The first little comment I'd make to you is that this chapter of Melchit's textbook, Chapter 9, Aristotle, the Reality of the World, is a very good chapter and well worth the time reading. He is well versed in the philosophy of Aristotle, and he is, of course, favourably disposed toward it, and so I recommend it to you. It's very worthwhile reading it in its fullness. Again, you'll see we have the learning objectives for the week. Again, you should use this slide to help you keep track of what you need to know, what you need to understand. Combine this with the worksheet, which I hope you're now using. And between these things, this will help you prepare for things like our tests. What was the importance of Aristotle to the history and story of philosophy? He's made a lasting contribution in a number of areas: natural science, mathematics, logic, political theory, ethics, politics, philosophy. It's interesting that Hegel, one of the great German philosophers, said to him, that is Aristotle, the greater number of the philosophical sciences owe their origin and distinction. A very high praise indeed. And a far more interesting document, the Encyclopaedia Britannica, says of Aristotle that he was the first genuine scientist in history. And there it adds, every scientist is in his debt. So we begin to see that, like Plato, Aristotle is one of those giants in the history of philosophy and Western thought. And it's very worthwhile you coming to know and understand him. What was he trying to do? Well, like Plato, he's wanting to explain change and non-change and one and many and these other issues, these big questions. But there's an important difference here, and that is that there was a fundamental difference between Plato and Aristotle. And so there's a sense in which he's going to have to try and establish his own philosophy and justify and give arguments for the validity of his arguments and position. He also was a teacher and a writer. It's said that he had 2,000 slaves working for him when he eventually established the Lyceum in Athens, under the sponsorship of Aristotle, of Alexander the Great. Really quite significant work there. At the same time, he doesn't wish to he may want to disagree with his teacher, but he doesn't want to distract from the great work of Plato. And of course, he has to develop his own answers to the big questions. I've left these questions for you to look at. You can go through them, and you'll see we'll address them as we go through the various sections. Let's talk for a moment about the man Aristotle. You can see from the timeline before you that he was very much the student for Plato for 20 years. We've talked about that before. During the 20 years, he was a tutor. You can see that his lifespan, particularly his productive lifespan, where he wrote and produced, was that period after the death of Plato, when he was under the patronage of the monarchs of Macedonia, including Alexander the Great. But because he was under that patronage, when things came to an end with the death of Alexander, the result was that the Athenians began to have an anti-Macedonian attitude. They wanted their freedom again. They didn't want to be under the heel of this dictatorship. Indeed, Aristotle found himself in the same position Socrates found himself, being charged with crimes against the state, namely that he did not believe in the gods of the city and that he was polluting the morals of the young. And so he fled Athens a year before he died, making this statement that's attributed to him: "I'll not allow the Athenians to sin against philosophy twice." Well, you can look at that for yourselves now. That's a brief look at his life. He is different from Plato, not only in terms of his philosophy, but also in terms of his own life. Plato was a bachelor, as far as we can tell. Aristotle was a family man. He had a son, Nicomachus, that we know about, and he came from not an aristocratic family like Plato, but he came from an influential family, influential in the court of the kings of Macedonia. While he came to study under Plato at the academy and taught rhetoric there, the differences between Plato and Aristotle was such that when Plato died, the successor was not Aristotle, it was Plato's nephew. And so that's when Aristotle left Athens. He went to the court of King Hermanus in Mycenae, married the king's daughter, and later, when Philip's son Alexander turned 13, he was invited to go and begin tutoring Alexander, which he did. He did that for 5 years. He was very respected and admired by both Philip and Alexander, and said to be influential in affecting them both. And see, some of Alexander's view of the East and approach to the East is attributable to the teaching of Aristotle. So it is said. But in 335 he established his own school, the Lyceum. It flourished. It was well funded. He married a second time there, and that's when his son was born. But again, that went for 20 years. Most of his books were published during this period of time. But he fled after the death of Alexander to the island of Chalcis, and he died within a year of getting there at age 62. But his legacy is through his written works. It is said that he wrote over 200 works. Only some 31 have continued in circulation. He wrote on a vast range of topics, from natural science to rhetoric, logic, poetry, politics, philosophy. He wrote classifying animals into genera and specific species. He wrote on marine biology. He is famous in terms of some of the insightful observations he made. But the heart of the issue for us as we begin to look at the philosophy of Aristotle, we see that there is a fundamental difference between Plato on the one hand and Aristotle on the other. And understanding this difference is important because after the life and work and writing of Aristotle, Western thinking has revolved around two approaches to knowledge and philosophy. The approach of Plato on the one hand and the approach of Aristotle on the other. Plato and Aristotle. The concept of reason alone and the concept of experiential knowledge alone. And it's worth pausing for a moment to contrast these two positions. I've given you some information on the slide. Plato used reason reflectively. He sat, thought, and began trying to formulate the big picture, and out of the big picture he understood where individual things fitted in. He went from the one to the many, from the universal to the particular. In other words, he considered that when he conceived a concept, it's that concept that gave shape and meaning to language, reality, and meaning. Aristotle, on the other hand, he didn't reason reflectively, he reasoned analytically. He reasoned from the particular, and by a reasoning process of induction, he developed a concept of the universal, the big picture. He went from the many to the one. He conceived that language was the key to unlocking the content of concepts and meaning and reality. Language was key. Two very different approaches to philosophy, worthy of understanding both. Now let's recall, before we go on, that Plato and Aristotle were involved in a debate. But it was not a debate like we're accustomed to today, where you gather the evidence and you research the evidence and you argue about who's got the more powerful evidence and the data to support their arguments. Their debate was a critique of each other's reasoning or justifications for their positions. It was a discussion about reasons. Very different from the way we would approach things today. And so all of Aristotle's objections to Plato's ideas, for example, innate ideas, are critiques of Plato's justification. And remember that Plato's justification for his innate ideas was based upon the use of mathematical concepts and on the falsification arguments or principles displayed in the slave boy's discussion of the square. And so we can summarise Aristotle's difficulties with Plato with the following: the famous third man critique. And we'll look at that in a moment in the next slide. But Plato had other problems. He doesn't consider that Plato has appropriately explained the dualist problem. Plato believes that a human being is a body and a soul. The reality is made up of the world of forms and the world of objects. And he said, you can't really properly explain the relationship between the two. Now, by the way, this is a difficulty that all dualists have. Many people in the West, perhaps some of you, I certainly do, I'm a dualist. And one of the challenges for us is to explain how these two things fit together, body and soul. How is it that we are these two realities? And it's a challenging problem. Now, Aristotle's going to come up with his own explanation of that later on. But he wasn't satisfied with Plato's explanation. And secondly, he viewed the fact that Plato didn't explain how particular objects actually come into existence. He was very unimpressed with the concept of the gods existing in the world of forms, taking forms and throwing us back into the world and we're born. He was not impressed with that argument. Nor does he consider Plato's explanation of an eternally unchanging form, accounting for ever-changing particulars. Now, you can read those arguments. They're not important. All you need to do is they're there. But it's worth taking a moment on the third man argument. Excuse me. Now, Melchett gave you a discussion of this argument because he recognises that obviously Plato discusses the same critique of his own position, because it's clear that Plato and Aristotle had been discussing it, so Plato discusses the third man argument. He does it in excuse me, in terms of greatness. Aristotle, on the other hand, puts forth in terms of humanness. Well, I'm going to spend a moment or two using my funny diagram to try and help you get a picture of it. I'm going to oversimplify it, but hopefully helpfully with you. You have here in the centre of our diagram, we have the form, Aristotle. And from this form is derived Aristotle. I'm going to have fun with this because I'm going to have Aristotle's twin brother that comes from the form. So here we have Aristotelness, we have Aristotle and Aristotle's twin. But in this world of objects, the world of change, we have two objects that obviously are alike, but there are going to be ways in which they're not alike. And once we list a lot of these alikes and not alikes, what we'll come up with is this third object up here, this third form, not object, not form, which is a summation of these two. And so we have the need of this to explain the relationship here. And we can further develop that argument. Let's suppose there is another person over here, this person here, way outside our here. And we ask, what's the relationship between this person and these two people? Well, lo and behold, we need to create yet another super form above. And again, we have the lines coming up. And what we have here is an infinite regression in which we go on and on forever to try to explain the difference between these two people. That's just a simplified presentation of the third man argument. In other words, given that Plato's explanation of the relationship between Aristotle and his twin is they're both imperfect in relation to the form, Aristoteleness, you end up with this third man argument, and he's not impressed with that. All right, we now turn to the starting point for Aristotle's metaphysics. His starting point is fundamentally nature, the natural world as it's perceived by the human being, the intelligibility of the world or the objects of the world display themselves to us as we carefully observe them. However, it's important for us to pause for a moment and again make a distinction between Plato on the one hand and Aristotle on the other. On the one hand, both Plato and Aristotle viewed a rationality and intentionality, an intelligibility that was within the framework of the cosmos. As far as Plato was concerned, that intelligibility was inherently operating in the whole. Whereas with Aristotle, that intelligibleness is perceived within all the objects in the world. Every object has within it a principle of intelligibility. And on that basis, he's going to develop a view of understanding change. But before we get there, let's pause for a moment and note a distinction. Nature was to be understood in two ways as far as Aristotle was concerned. Firstly, there were nature facts and there were artifacts. Nature facts like trees and shrubs, all the things of nature that are non-man-made. They come about because of nature. And he said these have the principle of intelligibility within them. And what's important about that distinction is that every one of those things has within it an intelligibility which gives them movement and rest and direction. Take a plant, for example. The seed has within it an intelligibility which is going to drive it to produce a shoot out of the ground, then produce a shrub, and then produce a tree, and so on. Whereas artifacts are things that are created by human beings, and these have intelligibility imposed upon them. They're made, and they have movement by being acted upon. If I have a tree, have a statue, I push it over. It moves because I move it. It has intelligibility imposed upon it. I create something. By creating it, it displays an intelligence that I've imposed upon it. It's an important distinction for him, because that's what is going to make his explanation of change without using Plato's forms. And he's going to say, first and foremost, that all natural things, all natural objects are made up of two things, form and matter. And that includes nature facts and artifacts. And he's going to use a principle of first principles. So I'm going to talk about that more when we come to epistemology, but just right now, these are the simple ideas that we have so clear, we have sure of them, they're the most certain things we can see, they're the simplest ideas, these first principles. And these relate to his four causes. There is the material cause, the formal cause, and the efficient cause, and lastly the final cause. Now, material cause, it's the stuff out of which something's made or created. And it is just filled with potentiality. You think of a stone, for example, or a tree. There it is sitting there, and it's got all kinds of potential. But then the formal cause comes together with it, and it becomes the expression of what the object actually is. It is actualized by the form. And then you have the efficient cause, which is the proximate cause, the proximate mover cause, that creates the actuality. You can see in the diagram here, you have the efficient cause being the sculptor, the material being the rock, just filled with potentiality. The formal cause, what's in the man's mind, and the final cause, well, it's going to be a statue that's used in some great building in Athens. The final cause is the end for which it exists. And every object, artifact or natural fact, goes through this process of material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and final cause. And in this way, he is explaining that change comes about because of what's in it or what's done to it. And he has to explain that. But this leaves us with a distinction between Plato and Aristotle, which we need to grasp. For Plato, forms existed in the eternal, unchangeable world of being. For Aristotle, forms exist inside the thing itself. So you see these two things here, these two little diagrams. Plato's form of the apple exists up in the world of ideas. The form of appleness is inside the thing itself as far as Aristotle is concerned. But this raises the question, could change be purposeful? Remember, like Plato, he sees intelligibility and rationality driving the world. There's this thing that's there, what the pre-Socratics would call logos. Well, things contain within them the principles of intelligibility, and so the basic answer is yes, everything is inherently purposeful, and all change is purposeful. This is what takes us back to the word telos, or goal, purpose. Intelligia, I beg pardon. Recall the relation between material cause and formal cause is one of a movement from potentiality to actuality. And so the little diagram which Melchett has at page 197, I've used it, has been used elsewhere as well. You see on the one hand you have a primary substance, and it's acted upon by form and produces an object. And that displays both potentiality and actuality. And hence, the bottom line here is that all nature moves from potentiality to actuality, which then in turn becomes a new potentiality. It's an ongoing changing process. Well, that brings us to a rather surprising conclusion. Perhaps I've best thought about it first in terms of a question. What is matter without form? Now, Aristotle would answer that it's purely, potentially, something. It's undefined, it's indiscriminate, in that sense, it's nothing. Remember, he's using language to describe what is there, and he says basically, it's nothing. But matter is inherently a substance. It's what the stuff is. And what transforms matter into substance is substance. So Aristotle introduces the idea here of essence. And essence is the essential or primal definition of what something is, including matter. And remember again, it's language. This is a language analysis. The form essence is the substance of the substance itself. Essence is a substance, but it's obviously a very different kind of primordial substance. But according to this line of reasoning, we can have formal substances which have no normal substance, but a unique kind of substance. They're not composed of matter or form. So that really raises another question. Those formal substances, could we have a formal substance that is purely actuality? That just is filled with actualness, existence. At this point, Aristotle is beginning to move to a different kind of metaphysical dualism. very different from Plato's. And these are pure actualities. And to discuss this, he looks at the cosmology of the time. He looks at the heavenly bodies and he sees them continually moving on a regular basis, and he sees them as moving in great circles, and they eternally move in those circles. But again, he asserts that there must have been something that caused those things to start moving. You can't have movement unless there's something that causes the movement. Something has got to transform an actuality, a potentiality into an actuality. So what kind of movement must that be? And he gives an astonishing answer. It's one that doesn't move. Now remember, this is a linguistic analysis, if you will. Why is it that this prime mover doesn't move? Well, in effect, this prime mover is a final mover, an ultimate cause of movement. It's as if it sits out there at the end of all things and draws everything to it. And once everything has reached that ultimate final cause, it stops. Hence, the prime mover, or the ultimate mover, doesn't move. Melchett has an illustration of a baseball which begins the process of movement through games and people and play, and ultimately it reaches the World Series where it ends. And it's the World Series, in a sense, that's drawing the baseball all the way to the World Series. It's a great illustration. No illustration really works, but it's great. But hence the unmoved mover. And because everything is drawn to this final cause, Aristotle says that it's got to be a good thing. Because everything likes it. That's why it's drawn toward it. It just can't help get there, and it's got to be good. There's a sense in which what we have here is the embryonic form of the cosmological argument for the existence of God. But that does leave us with a rather interesting question. What kind of God is this prime mover? Well, he doesn't move, but he's certainly different from the demiurge in Plato's Timaeus. But he's also very different from, say, the Christian God, or the Muslim God, or the Jewish God, because those gods, or that God, is inherently a person and has relationships and is certainly active, whereas the prime mover is not active. He does nothing other than think. But clearly the prime mover, like other gods, is transcendent. He's above the world and beyond it, and he's an actuality. He exists. It's not surprising that Aristotle's view of God is controversial. But not only is his view of God controversial, his view of the soul is controversial. Because Aristotle is going to end up saying that the soul is immortal, or at least a portion of the soul is immortal. And he begins that discussion with saying the soul is the essence of the person. It's the life-giving principle of motion within the something. And he's going to draw a parallel between plants and animals and human beings. And what's more, the soul gives character to what that thing is. Hence you have the three levels of the soul you see in the diagram. You have the nutritional soul, you have the sensitive soul, and the rational soul. The nutritional soul gives life. The sensitive soul has feeling and emotions and responses, movement, and the individual soul has reason. It's the rational soul. And with that in mind, he's going to discuss the relationship between the body and the soul. And again, he says that the soul is the form of the natural body, the form of the natural body that potentially possesses life. Back to potentiality and actuality again. And a human being involves a body and a soul. But when it comes to this soul, this nous, mind, he says the mind has two parts. It's the passive mind and the active mind. Now the passive mind, he sees, as something which is part of the body, just receives information. It's connected to the five senses. It feels and gets the data and forms the perceptions. There it is. It doesn't form the perceptions, it gets the perceptions. But it's the active mind which takes those perceptions and does something with them. It's an actuality. It's only an actuality can turn something from potential into actuality. So the active mind, he says, is mixed with nothing. It's the non-material part of the body. And that brings us to this controversial and much debated section in one of Aristotle's works called On the Soul, where he makes this argument, concluding as I have underlined for you. This alone is immortal and eternal, and debated ad nauseum as to what he meant by eternal and what is eternal or not. And I leave you to formulate your own views of that, but quite clearly I've gone with that, that's good. He really has an interesting argument for the existence of the soul. So let's pause now. Aristotle's explanations. Change and non-change, interesting. One and many, very interesting. Perhaps he really says the only thing that's real are particulars and not universals, but that's a matter of discussion. A very interesting discussion of form and matter, different. And of course then there's body and soul. So he certainly has addressed all the big issues. Before we can move on to epistemology, we need to pause for a moment and consider the question of substance and the categories. When teaching Aristotle, I'm never sure whether I should begin with a discussion of substance and the categories, or I should use it as I am using it here today, as a bridge between the study of metaphysics and Aristotle's view of epistemology, a sense in which substance and categories connects the two. It's important, I think, for us to begin to remind ourselves that Aristotle is very concerned how to analyse an argument, how to break it apart. What are the logical forms behind it? And what's the relationship between the terms within an argument or a statement? And he was convinced that the starting point was to begin with how you connect terms and statements. Statements are the whole, terms are the parts. And how you use terms to connect the elements of a statement. In other words, he viewed substance as the building block of matter. And remember, he's using language to describe matter. We're not doing a microscope, looking down a microscope, he's describing things. And he concludes that every uncombined term, for example the term man, indicates a substance. And he's confident that language, carefully crafted, does stand for something, man, and for some place, and so on. So his discussion of the categories is an attempt to describe how things exist and what kind of existence they exhibit, what kind of substance they are, and how that fits together in a statement. So let's turn our attention now to some observations first about the nature of substance. For anything to exist, to be real, it has to exist. It has to have substance. You can't exist without substance. Whatever substance a substance is, depends on the substance for its existence. This seems to be double talk, but it's important to understand that substance is the basic building block. Thus, any substance is what something is in its most primary and fundamental sense. What makes a given substance a substance? Its form is his answer. Now, let's look at some of the illustrations he gives. The first four are most important. The first is substance, the second is quality, the third is quality, the fourth is relationship. Substance, quantity, quality, relationship. Now, all the terms are able to be built into an argument. Substance, quality, these are terms. But they can't be used on their own to describe reality. For example, take man. If I walked up to you and said, man, you'd go, yes. Quite clearly, it has to be combined with some other terms to form a statement, to be able to describe. So let's build on the building blocks that he's given us. Substance, man. Quantity, 6 feet tall. Quality, educated. Relationship, man, 6 foot tall, well educated, the smartest man in all of Athens. Ergo, Socrates. He viewed that being able to take all of these terms, using the laws of reasoning, which we'll come to when we look at our logic, study of logic, become the building blocks to evaluate these statements. And working out whether that statement is true, valid, expresses reality, or something else. Now we'll come back to this issue of substance and these term relationships in our discussion of epistemology in a moment. But at this point, Aristotle is using the categories to tell us what an object is and what the substance of that object is and how it relates to things around it. And that's the fundamental use of the categories. And with that, we'll pause and go across in a moment to the second video and to our discussion of epistemology and value theory.